All right, now I'd like to welcome to the show Thomas Savidge, a research fellow at the American Institute for Economic Research. Welcome to Free the Economy, Thomas.
Hey, thanks so much for having me on, Richard.
So, to start with, can you tell us a little bit about your organization, AIER, and how your work fits into their mission?
Sure thing. So AIER stands for the American Institute for Economic Research. Um, we are a 501(c)(3) nonprofit organization aimed at educating folks on the benefits of property rights and a free society and free markets. Particularly, particularly my area, we have, of course, we have several verticals: economic freedom, combating collectivism, our public choice project, our sound money project, and a couple of others. My work generally fits into the economic freedom portfolio, where I spend a lot of time working on fiscal policy, which unfortunately there's not a lot of good news there.
Well, so recently you wrote a paper about government debt as part of AIER's new Explainer paper series. So, why, of all possible economics topics, did you choose government debt as the inaugural topic to launch this series?
Oh, well, that's a great question. There's there was a number of factors. So the purpose of our explainer series really is to get these complicated economic topics out to the everyman. And that's our mission, really, educating the general public about these often complicated but extremely important issues. And government debt, really is more important now than ever. What we're seeing here is, record levels of national debt, of debt to GDP ratio. Our net interest payments have exceeded spending on national defense, deficits, hitting $1 billion. And people are wondering, what can we do about it? And you have some folks out there, like I'm going to pick on Paul Krugman, for example, who say debt is just money we owe to ourselves. And that is definitely not the case.
Yeah, and so just to start with, I think it makes sense to look at the current size of the national debt. You wrote that uh, recent numbers as of July 2024, the national debt's around $34.58 trillion, a little over $103,000 for every man, woman, and child in the United States. And that number, of course, continues to climb. Now, now, my entire life, people have been thinking about the federal debt as some sort of impossibly large number that normal people just can't really even conceive of. But it actually has really increased dramatically in real numbers in recent years, hasn't it?
Oh, absolutely, Richard. And the sad thing about those numbers you cited is that those numbers are already out of date, and we're now way past $35 trillion in debt owed by the public, which specifically, so that phrase, debt owed by the public are people who purchase treasury securities, and it's not debt that's owed between entities of government, like, say, bonds, the Social Security Administration trust fund purchases from the Treasury. But it's as you mentioned, it's something that really has accumulated, and especially over the past several years, given the CARES Act, the American Rescue Plan, massive amounts of government spending in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as, in the recent presidential administration that seems to really hope to stimulate the economy with government spending, because at the end of the day, the root of the debt problem is a spending problem.
And so that dollar amount alone, I guess, doesn't really tell the whole story, though. And um, again, in your paper, we say total public debt's over 120% of GDP, gross domestic product, for the value of everything produced in the entire country.
Yep.
Uh, so the size of the total economy. Uh, so you point out that even during World War II, when the federal government was buying fighter planes and warships, as fast as they could, be manufactured, the debt ratio was only 110% rather than 120% of GDP. So how did we find ourselves in this situation where we are even more indebted than when we were during like America's greatest wartime moment of peril, just because, traditionally you go back to, say, the Keynesian view of government economics, which is
Mhm.
that when times are good, we bring in tax revenue and we put some in the bank, and then when times are bad we go into debt because government spending is supposed to be counter-cyclical, right? Because if people are suffering, then government goes into debt and helps them out. But that it's supposed to tilt back in the other direction at some point, right?
Well, that's the thing. It's one thing. Ideally, of course, it's they would pay that down during more prosperous times, but we have to look at the incentives because the incentives really tell the story, and that are when we're talking about incentives, we're asking what are government actors' goals, whether it's elected officials or bureaucrats. When we're looking at elected officials, the economist Thomas Sowell has the famous phrasing. Politicians have two priorities: get elected and get reelected. Whatever priority number three it's far behind one and two. And then it's also important to look at the unelected bureaucrats in Washington as well. What are their incentives? How do they measure success? And the way government bureaucrats measure success are the number of people you have working under you and the size of your discretionary budget. And if you don't have funding going to your office and your agency, it's going to go to another agency. And so you want to maximize, what your agency is doing. So that not only means tackling the problems you've been asked to tackle, it also means going out and looking for other problems. And at the end of the day, elected officials wanting to win elections and bureaucrats wanting to maximize their bureaucratic success have led to massive amounts of spending, even during more prosperous times, because they want to, elected officials see massive spending, especially for, say their district, bringing home the bacon, as they say, really will help them win. And in the same way, bureaucrats want to help themselves. And by increasing spending there, it all comes at the cost of taxpayers. And to compound the problem, instead of paying for those that spending increase in taxes, which would be really politically unpopular, they are instead putting it on their tab and pushing the debt out to have it be paid by future generations. Because at the end of the day, that's really what government debt finance spending really is. And the economist James Buchanan put it perfectly. You're not there, even though, say, somebody buying a treasury security, say an investor, even though they're giving the government money, they are likely, 9.999 times out of 10, they're going to get paid back with interest when that treasury debt fully matures. The taxpayers today, they enjoy the spending without the tax increases. And so the politicians love that. But at the end of the day, when that debt comes due, when they have to make those debt service payments, it ends up falling on future taxpayers, whether that's you and I in a couple of years, or that's our children and grandchildren.
Yeah,
And, oh,
I hope our
sorry, yeah,
grandchildren end up being really rich because that
yeah.
they're gonna they're gonna need to be.
Well, that's it. I have if you don't mind me just saying, I have two young daughters, both under 3 years old. They're not even out of diapers yet, and they're already on the hook for over $100,000 in government spending. And sometimes, of course, it doesn't look like tax increases. Sometimes to pay out this debt service, it ends up meaning crowding out funds for other programs too.
Mhm. So, in a way, we've all been part of creating this debt because, I think to some extent, we probably all benefited from the government spending that was debt financed upfront to begin with. But we don't all equally line up on the other side of the ledger. And, the question of who owns the debt, I think is interesting. About, you know, uh, the question is, do we, like you said, the Paul Krugman attitude, do we really have to worry about repaying it because collectively we all just owe it to ourselves in some sense. Um, but of course, we don't all owe it to ourselves or each other equally.
That's right. That's a great point. And that's one of the big questions we aim to answer in this explainer, because it's, folks see that huge 35 trillion and climbing number and they say, who's this money owed to? And for there's, of course, the biggest collective group are what we call private domestic investors. And so that's large businesses. It's funny because even state and local governments and their pension funds end up getting counted as private investors.
Mhm.
Um, and that's because they operate independent. That's at least the Treasury says they operate independently of the federal government. How much those state and local governments have in independence is a question for another day. But even if we take out those state and local government entities, domestic investors make up about 35.5% of the people buying Treasury securities. Um, and so at the end of the day, it's a lot of that. It's also the Federal Reserve and other government accounts purchasing that debt as well. And there is a long sordid history, which my colleagues at the Sound Money Project have really outlined on political pressure from Washington on the Federal Reserve to finance spending with newly created money and all of the problems that come with that as well. And then actually, my colleague Peter Earle and I actually just came out with a piece in our daily economy blog yesterday about the sort of cronyism that comes about from depending on so much on debt spending, on debt finance spending.
Well, yeah, and we should also mention what's not included in the debt in these debt numbers, $36 trillion debt numbers. Things like future Social Security and Medicaid obligations, Medicare obligations. So look down the road at that expected spending, and you're looking at, trillions of more dollars in the future, many trillions of more dollars. Um, but I guess the, the big difference there, and one of the reasons why Social Security and Medicare obligations aren't usually calculated in the like, what's our, federal debt number, is that, while we're committed to theoretically paying off the debt we already owe, as a country, Congress can pass new legislation, like raising the retirement age or other things like that, to change the parameters of those programs, Social Security and Medicare, in ways that could, again, theoretically, reduce that future expense and obligation. Um, how do you look at that? Those two parts, the sort of the obvious national debt, and then the likely future debt with these sort of quote required spending categories.
That's a great question, Richard. And you're right there where there's so with Social Security and Medicare, they're referred to as unfunded obligations. And those are promises made to people paying into Social Security and Medicare that are going to have to be paid out, assuming nothing about these programs change. And that was a great point you brought up too, where there's some flexibility in that. And if there is willingness to change policies, we can reduce those unfunded obligations and improve the solvency of both of those programs. Now, of course, they call Social Security the third rail of American politics. And because, any attempts to even touch it is basically amounts to political suicide. So when accounting for this, I think, we want to we want to say, prepare for the worst and hope for the best. And that preparing for the worst is, they are not going to, Washington is not going to willingly make changes to this program until it is absolutely necessary and the programs are about to go insolvent. And so we want to treat that until proven otherwise, as though, that 70 trillion number of those unfunded obligations as locked in, as, those as promised payments that are going to have to be paid for by painful tax increases and painful spending cuts.
Well, on top of all of this other stuff happening at the federal level, we also have, which you sort of alluded to, state and local governments, and they have, debt loads of their own. Uh, they don't enjoy the luxury the federal government has in terms of printing more money, but they can contract debts of their own. And often they have, there's municipal bonds that are issued to pay for things like infrastructure projects and, whatnot. And so you wrote, currently state and local governments have a total of 4 trillion, $12,000 per person in outstanding bonded obligations. Uh, does that mean the states are in a less dire situation than the federal government, or are we still pretty worried about them?
Unfortunately, I wish it were a less dire situation, but as you mentioned, there's some aspects that are different from state and local governments and different from the federal government, which could either be a blessing or a curse, right? So, of course, they don't have access to the money printer, so they can't just print away their problems and they actually have to face them, which could provide a good opportunity for some fiscal responsibility and some of the harder conversations that folks in Washington are not willing to have. Um, but the problem there is, state and local governments have this massive amount of debt. And then on top of that, they also rely heavily on transfers from the federal government. Um, According to some of the state budget data, the average state gets about 35% of their spending from federal dollars. And so that's it. And that number has grown, from the early 90s through now. And so practically a third of state and local governments' budgets come from federal transfers. And about 55% of that, so more than half of those federal transfers are for Medicaid. And now the big thing there that states will really run into trouble is the Medicaid expansion. And for those listeners who aren't familiar with that, when Medicaid was first expanded under the Affordable Care Act, the federal government promised to cover 100% of the Medicaid expansion, right?
Yeah.
They said it was a free lunch. And over the course of President Trump's administration, it was whittled down to a 90%, 10% match. And so that doesn't sound like a lot. Of course, the federal government's still picking up a large portion of the tab, but even the states just having to pick up that 10% accounts for filling billions of dollars in a budget gap. And even if that matching rate were to adjust again to say, even if it's just 75-25, the states will then have to come up with billions of dollars to fill in those budget gaps. And that's really where you're going to see states strain, especially states that are not prepared to fill those massive budget gaps, as we saw in 2020. And of course, one of the states that, was really in a dire situation was Illinois.
Yeah, it does seem Illinois has managed to get itself into some multiple dire fiscal situations.
Absolutely. Yeah. I've equated Illinois with Greece during the Eurozone crisis, which unfortunately it's high debt to GDP ratio, rampant corruption, and it seems at almost every level of government in Illinois. You even hear about mayors in small towns of Illinois using personal funds for vacations, and the rot unfortunately runs deep. And of course, in 2020, when there was the massive economic contraction, one of the first things Illinois did was not, they didn't say, let's get our fiscal house in order. The first thing they did was went to Congress and asked for a bailout. And that was in addition, mind you, in addition to the CARES Act, they said, we need more money. We need to cover our pension funds. And then, you read this, there's a letter out there that was leaked from the Illinois state legislature to their members of Congress. And it reads like a wish list to Santa. And one of the lines I'll never forget, it was, so many, I think it was $1 billion, no questions asked. Don't ask us what we're going to use it for. Don't ask us where it's going. Don't ask for it back. Just to cover general expenses. And so that's that really is a worrying aspect. So as states face their own fiscal crunches from massive unfunded pension liabilities, which is a little different from, say, a Social Security promise, because those unfunded pension liabilities for those retired public employees are often protected by contract. And in several cases, Illinois being one of them, those promises are guaranteed by the state constitution. So say in Illinois, they will continue to pay out those promised pension benefits long after they stop paying for police, fire, and emergency services, which is a serious problem.
Yeah, and so, we were talking about like at the federal level, there's reasons to be not particularly optimistic because the political and behavioral influences drive both Congress and government bureaucrats excuse me, to want to spend more and want to expand their footprint of authority and the number of people to work for them. And if it's your job to write rules and implement expensive government policies, then that's what you're going to spend your time doing, is doing more of
Mhm.
that. Um, on the maybe on the flip side, maybe when it comes to states, there's a reason to be a little bit more optimistic because there's another kind of market reality at work here, and that's bond ratings and interest rates, right? So if a state has a poor record or of fiscal management and there's worried that they might default, for example, it's going to be harder for them to issue bonds and debt. They have to pay higher percentage rates for it. Is that a reason why we can say, I mean, is that a sufficient disciplinary mechanism?
Uh, yes and no. And I think it really comes back to that backstop of the federal government and the question, it comes back to the billion-dollar question of what happens when a state cannot pay out its debt, cannot pay back its investors. The last time we saw that was Arkansas in 1933. They issued revenue bonds to fund highways, hoping that you know the commerce coming from highway construction would and that commerce would help pay for the debt. Of course, during the Great Depression, that business never really came about. Arkansas attempted to declare sovereign immunity and said, we are not going to pay we're not going to pay this debt. And then the bond investors, who were most of them were based in New York, but based elsewhere, went to their friends in DC and said, "Hey, we need to be made whole. Can you help us out?" And so the federal government ended up taking the bond investors' side and saying, we're going to withhold federal funds, specifically from the Public Works Administration, part of that New Deal alphabet soup of agencies. They said, we're going to withhold federal funds to Arkansas until you guys sort this out. That brought Arkansas back to the bargaining table. Although it's kind of interesting, we've seen more recently with municipal bankruptcies like Detroit, municipal bankruptcies across California, and even Puerto Rico as well, which Puerto Rico seems to be the one of the test cases as a test case for state default should that ever happen with the states. I hope it doesn't. And I hope, say a state like Illinois gets their act together before that happens. Um, but so it really comes down to what happens when the state cannot pay back its promises. And even if, say, there was an option of bankruptcy for the states, bankruptcy is still a very, very messy process. And so, I'm glad you're looking at the glass half full, Richard, but I'm still a bit worried there. I'm still a bit worried about that situation with the states. And ultimately it comes down to uh, when a state defaults and they end up going to Washington asking for a bailout, what will the folks in Washington say? And I am incredibly worried that the folks in Washington are just going to say, of course we'll bail you out. And that
Right.
totally changes, the behavior of every other state as well.
Well, yeah, I think, I think the assumption today is that Congress would just say, well, the state government of Arkansas is too big to fail. And
Yes,
and having them go through anything that looked like a bankruptcy process would be too messy and too uncertain and problematic. So we'll just add the bailout debt. The feds will assume any necessary bailout debt, and we'll just put it on that pile of $36 trillion dollars, and then we'll let the people in Arkansas or Illinois or whatever state it ended up being go back to business as usual. Obviously, there's a lot of people who've written about bailouts in general have said that just incentivizes bad risk-taking behavior. So I think, I would certainly expect that if we saw an actual something as big as a statewide bailout, state government bailout, that it wouldn't be the last. That people in
unfortunately, yeah.
every other state would say, "Well, it's not looking good. It's looking messy. We're really in debt." But I mean, the Feds bailed out the other states, so why not just keep going?
That's right, Richard. And I think even worse too are states that are doing relatively well being willing to take on more risk. And they say, oh, well, if the risk pays off, we're going to do great. And if not, we could get a pretty sweet bailout from DC. And that sort of, as you mentioned, it feeds into that. more openness to risk and inevitably more openness to that kind of volatility because they know they have that promise of a bailout.
And and the way you sort of like phrase this is interesting because going back to like the Arkansas example, because I would, I always imagine the like prime movers here as the people asking for the bailout. So, like the members of like a state legislature that have overspent and not saved for bad times, like they would go or they would send their state's congressional delegation and to lobby for a bailout. But of course, the people who are owed the money, the people who bought those state bonds might be the ones who say, bail out us. Like they don't care about the, they might not care about the state government of Illinois or any of the people, the governor or the treasurer or any of the legislatures or even the people that live there. They just want their money back from the bonds that they think might not get repaid. So you have this sort of two-front potential lobbying coalition for bailouts, both the state government leaders who overspent in the first place, but then just the private investors who happen to have bought those bonds and they figure, well, maybe we can get the feds to bail us out.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Richard. And it's even more interesting too in those in the municipal defaults, whether it's Detroit or in various localities across California. The two another big interest group in addition to say the bond investors are the retired public employees. And it's interesting to see throughout the litigation that um, when it comes down to whether the retired public employees are going to be made whole, the bond investors, it's usually the bond investors that end up getting a haircut. Because, I guess, I'm not a lawyer. I haven't looked, specifically as to why, but it's kind of interesting to see that it really holds true that even though um, those unfunded liabilities are considered quote unquote soft debt. Um, it's that debt is being prioritized over, say, even, say the quote unquote traditional or hard debt of a bond that's been promised, even if it is backed by the full faith and credit of that governing entity.
Well, yeah, I could definitely see that depending on how a deal like that ends up being negotiated, especially if the, existing politicians in the state are negotiating it because the retired state workers who are, or city employees who are potentially left without uh, their their pension checks are voters, and they're a lot more sympathetic than a portfolio manager in New York City who may have put a bunch of money into municipal bonds.
Oh yeah, that's absolutely right. And yeah, that's a great point, Richard, because and again, it all comes back to incentives, right? It all comes back to incentives. Even if you're in a fiscal crisis, you're still trying to get reelected, right?
Yeah. So I think, zooming back for a minute and looking at all of this, at the state level, the federal level, all this debt, um, what are the long-term prospects for actually paying it off, right? So, on one level you could say like, well, a giant national government like the United States will always be engaged in some sort of debt finance. It'll always be using debt as a tool. There's no reason why the debt would ever need to go to zero, some would say. Um, and in the short to medium term, there's some motivation for paying a tax. As you mentioned earlier, the interest expenses starting to crowd out fiscal ability, Congress to pay for other things that are more politically attractive than just debt payments, right? And so that's where the desire to get elected and reelected may help us, right? If having to service too much federal debt means we can't spend money on other more popular things they want to spend money on, maybe that's an option. But in the long term, is paying off $36 trillion debt even possible? And are investors in big financial institutions at this point just kind of pricing in some sort of partial default and write down?
That's a great question. Credit rating agencies, of course, this has not gone unnoticed in the eyes of these credit rating agencies. And, most recently too, with Fitch downgrading, you had Moody's downgraded an outlook, but not a credit rating. Although I have to wonder if there is some cronyism there trying to keep those ratings themselves on federal debt, keeping that inflated. But I think it's, as my colleague Peter Earl put it, a lot of people have blown their credibility on whether or not, on, trying to figure out when this is all going to come to a head. And they're never quite right, right? It's like, it's always going to happen in the next 10 years. But I think a more effective educational tool is showing the effects that it's going to have. Um, and that could be not just people losing faith in treasury securities as a sound investment, as a reliably, relatively risk-free investment, which has been the case since at least the end of World War II. But it also means, folks losing faith in the dollar, not just domestically, but internationally as well. Um, and then when that happens, really, it's a lot of, what we could end up seeing is something similar to what Japan saw with its lost generation, where you have high taxes, weak economic growth, so weak, rising cost of living, lower standards of living, and high inflation. So your money's buying less and less. And that inevitably leads folks to, a lot of pretty despairing social outcomes where, it becomes way too costly to start a family. Um, folks really, and it really negatively, it's not just something that affects a spreadsheet, right? Of course, and you and I know this, but really want to hammer this home for the listeners out there that, these effects aren't just going to affect, a bottom line somewhere. It will have tangible effects on what we can do, what we can buy, and, the world that we're hoping to shape for those future generations, as I mentioned earlier.
Well, yeah, and so, when it comes to sort of strategies here, understanding that there's a sort of big public choice effect, which is that the people making policies have certain incentives that, you know, push them in ways that are not necessarily aligned with solving this problem. Um, what, other than, like you said, AER's, mission is just to educate the public about this in general. But in Congress, as policymakers, the political leaders that we might choose to vote or not vote for, what kind of what kind of solution should we be hoping to see?
That's a great question. And so fortunately, there's no shortage of solutions. At the moment, there's a shortage of political courage. But ultimately, what we'd love to see is a constitutional fiscal rule that binds the government and how much it spends. And sometimes that looks like something called the Swiss debt brake, where it acts kind of in that ideal model of fiscal policy you mentioned earlier, where if the government has to take on debt, during times of recession or depression, it then immediately pays them back because it's tied to a debt limit during times of prosperity. Or you say you have a constitutional tax and spending limit, like something the state of Colorado has, which limits the growth of government spending to the sum of population plus inflation. And anything taxed and spent over that limit has to be refunded to taxpayers. Um, and then on top of that, too, you also want to see ultimately, um, you want to see at the very least monetary policy constrained by a monetary rule, preferably constitutional, because constitutional rules cannot be overridden by a simple majority rule. And so rules constraining both fiscal and monetary policy, and if not, specifically, if more than just a monetary rule, a return to sound money as well. And my colleagues at the Sound Money Project have really done a lot of good work in that area, outlining the benefits and how to feasibly get there. I would also say too, an examination of an examination of what the federal government's spending on, and that includes some practices such as my friends at ALEC have called priority-based budgeting, which focuses on funding the core functions of government instead of just automatic increases. And I think Romina Bocha at the Cato Institute has called for called what she calls a fiscal BRAC commission. So the BRAC commission, Base Realignment and Closure Committee, required would looked at closing military bases. And her idea is to apply this basically to the entire federal budget. And the key thing there is what she calls silent approval, where the president comes up with a list of agencies to cut, and funding, budget line items to cut. And instead of members of Congress voting to approve the spending cuts, they have to voice their opinion to stop the cuts. And so it works into those incentives that we've been talking about. So they never go on record for saying they supported spending cuts, but they can go on record for saying they supported stopping spending cuts. And, that looks great on an election mailer, right?
Well, yeah, that you know the Brack Commission, the base closure project from sort of the end of the Cold War. I hear that get brought up all the time when it comes to kind of a smart strategy for getting around some of these public choice issues. And I just want to really quickly say that the problem with closing down any of those military bases was that each fiscal military base was in a specific state and in a specific congressional district, and so no one wanted to be go on record saying I voted to close this particular base because then everyone would be mad at them, right? Who wanted that base to
Oh,
stay
yeah.
open. And so what the commission did was put together a sort of group proposal for reductions that everyone kind of agreed were necessary. And so you could vote on the bundle and not be the bad guy accused of being responsible for supposedly closing any particular base. So it sort of spreads the responsibility around, but it also takes the like political sting out of a spending decision that again is generally considered to be the positive way to go.
That's right. And at the end of the day, we have these incentives here, and instead of trying to overcome them or change human behavior, you have to work with what you have. And as you mentioned, that you want to find solutions that work around these incentives and take away that political sting of making the fiscally responsible decision.
Well, yeah, I've always thought that you could have um, a president who is, elected on controlling spending, and they wouldn't have to cut anything, to the extent that, we still have non-trivial inflation every year going on in this country. All you would have to say is, well, we're holding the budget constant in nominal dollars for the next 4 years. We're not spending one more dollar, and then a little bit of extra inflation will do the work as well. Uh, that because I think people who like more government spending say, oh, well, government spends, you know, money on all these important, valuable, important, things for the less fortunate and global security and all these other things. So we can't have these, you can't slash the budget for any of these things. But I would say you don't have to slash anything. You just have to stop increasing it.
Well, that's
Uh,
the first step, right? And my
yeah.
first step is that, and I think too, at the end of the day, with the massive amounts of debt, the massive amounts of net interest, I think we are going to have to make some tough calls and some tough cuts. And I think there is, I'm sure we could talk about the solutions all day because there really is no shortage of solutions on whether it's, my colleagues and I at AIER or other folks, within our broader coalition, like-minded organizations, like-minded folks, great research out there. And I think at the end of the day, as much as it sounds like maybe it's like I might as well say, fairy dust or something, but political courage, it's going to take some political courage to get the ball rolling on this. And that I think, solving that really is the million dollar question, really. It's like, how do we solve that? And how do we initially get the ball rolling? Because once it gets rolling, we could start making progress. It's just a matter of getting it started. And, the person who could figure out how to get it started, who knows? Maybe there's a Nobel Prize waiting for him or something.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's at least the $1 trillion question. Uh,
Yes, the $35 trillion question.
All right. Well, that leaves us, some room for optimism, and
Yep.
I'm glad for that. So, well, Thomas, thank you so much for being with us. And before we go, please let everyone know where they can find all of your valuable, insightful, and important writing online.
Oh, thanks so much. It's a pleasure being on, Richard. You can check out AIER's website, aier.org, and the new Daily Economy website, which is the blog of AIER. That is thedailyeconomy.org as well.
All right. And are you on social media?
Oh yes, you can follow me on X, and that's where most of my content goes there.
All right. Thanks for being with us again, Thomas.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Richard.